a picture that I'm going to put up right over the top of this that was taken, and I do not know who the photographer is. As a matter of fact, I sent you a copy of it because you said you'd never seen it before. It's a low-down picture of you as you're launching on that last race. And looking at that picture, and everybody will be able to see it here, it is the quintessential picture of the last race at Lions, because you can literally see the people all the way down the guardrail to the finish line standing at just incredible photograph to me.
Yeah, as it turns out, I've seen that picture when you sent it to me, and interestingly enough, it was not the final. And there's a way that I knew that right off the bat. It's probably the semifinal, because those were the 2 rounds we ran in the left lane.
Okay.
The reason I know it wasn't the final is because the wing strut on the car is the original wing strut and not the baling wire that Mike Cool had fastened the wing supports back together with after the car shook so hard in the semi that it broke the firewall, and he had to drill holes in that and wire it to the chassis with baling wire. And it had also broken the stay rod on the rear wing, and he just ran couple of loops of 3 or 4 loops of baling wire, and off we went, So I was about half sure that when the parachute came out on the final that Donovan 417 was going to hit me in the back, and by the grace of God, everything stayed in place. But that's the only way that I was able to definitively recognize that couldn't have been the final.
Okay.
Because everything was in real good shape at that time. Shortly thereafter, it wasn't.
Well, and before we move on, this will be the last part of this with Lions. You described to me at one point that that you guys fired the cars up on the rollers out there, the spinners.
Yes.
You didn't have a starting motor like they do today. So you're on the spinners, and literally there's so many drunk people around that you don't even know if you can get to the starting line during that final.
True story.
That's incredible to me.
Yeah. And I remember as we were getting ready for the rollers to start turning over, seeing Larry Sutton and his assistant starting line crew. And of course, there was no security because they saw what was happening, and they were long gone, man. There wasn't a uniformed security officer or police officer anywhere on the premises. I think everybody said, we want to be as far from what's happening there as we can possibly get. But the Lions track crew managed to part the sea and force the spectators and drunks back enough to where now I could see the starting line, the Christmas tree. We fired the cars and pulled off and made the burnouts. And by the time I backed up, they had everybody back behind Larry Sutton. But that didn't account for the people who were sitting on the guardrail down at the 1,000-foot mark. And I distinctly remember saying to myself when I looked out there as I was getting ready to go up a 3-stage, I'm going to want to stay as close to the center as the track as possible because I don't want to be responsible for somebody's death, And the way some of those people were acting, I wouldn't have been surprised if somebody ran right out in front of me. I mean, it was just nuts. It was crazy. Fortunately, we got through that night without, to the best of my knowledge, nobody went to the hospital that night. And to be honest with you, that in itself is a miracle.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know why I feel such a connection to that race. I grew up at a local drag strip here. You said you were there at one time on business, Great Lakes Dragway here in Union Grove, Wisconsin. And to me, that when I see pictures of Lions, it gives me that same feeling of being at my hometown track here in the 70s. Maybe that's the connection, but it just feels like good old fashioned drag racing to me when I see the pictures of that.
And it was, I think in an earlier feature, you had mentioned that event was kind of a dividing line in cultures.
Yes.
Not just drag racing cultures, but all kinds of cultures. And I have to agree with you. December 1972 was the end of an era.
Yes.
And certainly I think that the closing of Lions Drag Strip, the last drag race, put an exclamation mark on that ending. Yeah. And of course, from there, we moved into a different world and carried on. To let you know how important Lions was to me, the first drag race I ever attended was at Lions Drag Strip in 1957.
Wow.
So pretty much continuously from 1957 through 1972, I was at Lions Drag Strip every time they opened the gates if I wasn't doing something else. That's the kind of connection that I had with the place. I watched my first drag racing hero, crash to his death in the Albertson Olds. Leonard Harris was a machine as a driver. I mean, he was absolutely phenomenal. He was a gymnast, and as a result, he had great feel for the car. And driving that Albertson Olds car, tuned by Gene Adams, during that period of time, late 1950s, that I was going to Lions every weekend before the fuel ban was over and they got nitromethane back there. That top gas dragster not only won almost every race at Lions, they dragged it back to the NHRA Nationals and won that. I mean, it was unbeatable. And I happened to be at Lions the night that the Albertson Olds was supposed to race against Jack Chrisman in the Howard Cam Special for number one on the Drag News Mr. Eliminator list. Big deal, big deal. And unfortunately, one of the cars had a mechanical problem. They had to postpone the match race, the 2 out of 3 match race. And somebody asked Leonard Harris to just make a test run in a new car that they had, that they were having real difficulties with, handling problems in particular. And they'd gone through 2 or 3 drivers trying to get the car down the track. And they were just looking for somebody that was really good to make a run to tell them what was wrong with the car and how they could fix it. Well, I was at the finish line standing on the top of an abandoned hot dog stand, which was a great vantage point, absolutely the best in the place as far as I was concerned. He ended up running against Quincy Automotive car, which was a dual engine Chevrolet with a front mounted supercharger, kind of a weird odd thing. And they were making test runs trying to get this combination down. And as the cars went by me, I saw a quick flash out of the corner of my eye and concentrated my vision on the car in the left lane, which was Leonard Harris. And he was having a huge crash. There were parts flying in the air everywhere. There was a piece of chain link fence that got wrapped up and shredded up all kinds of stuff and went out into a plowed field next to the return road. And when the dust settled in, I looked over there to see what was left. I said, I don't think that was a survivable crash. And I drove home the next morning. I got up and read the newspaper, and sure enough, he had passed away on that pass. Well, for a short period of time, I have to admit to having second thoughts about driving dragsters, just because that crash had been so violent and had involved my number one hero, drag racing driver in the world. I thought, man, I don't know, just, and he wasn't the only one losing his life at Lions and other places. It was a very dangerous time in drag racing. Well, I got over that real quick. And my passion after a couple of weeks was rekindled, and I was back at Lions every Saturday night, whatever. Followed up by seeing the dragster in the garage in San Pedro and my involvement with the Steckers and all of that kind of stuff. So, to try to explain to anybody, not necessarily just the last drag race, but Lions drag strip in general, in the full perspective, is almost impossible to do because so much of it is emotional.
Yeah.
The fact that every drag racer, that ever thought he was anybody that came west to race the Southern California hot shoes would end up at Lions more often than not. It was just a fact of life. I was so used to going out there, and here's Conrad Coletta with his bounty hunter. Wow, I read about him, and Art Malone, and all of these guys that would come from back east and down in the southeast and the Midwest and come out to Lions. That's the place they wanted to go, and those are the races they wanted to win, because it was, frankly, the epicenter of drag racing at that time. Yeah.
Well, with regard to the people that lost their lives in the sport at that point, I don't, in my own mind, I wasn't alive I was alive, but I didn't see any of that stuff. But to me, it always seemed to me that in everything where you're pioneering something, and let's face it, these were pioneers of the sport, there's always risk like that. And were all of them willing to take that risk, I guess, is the question. It seemed, did you guys all think you were invincible teenagers or young men? I mean, I remember being 22 years old and thinking I could take on the world. Was that the attitude?
I think in general, probably yes. In my personal case, absolutely not.
Okay.
I had seen too much. You know, my first love of motorsports wasn't drag racing. It was oval track racing. Like I had mentioned, at the age of 3, I became hooked on open wheel, dirt, oval racing, midget sprint cars, dirt champ cars, all of that kind of stuff. Those people were getting killed all the time.
Yeah.
You know, they were driving open cockpit vehicles with no roll cages. Most of them didn't even have a roll bar. And so most of my racing heroes at that time were oval racing all the way up to Indianapolis 500 type guys, and fatalities were just a routine thing at that time. So I was well aware. And from my personal perspective, I knew all along that driving a race car was a calculated risk. It was a risk that I was willing to take as long as I felt the odds were on my side. And that meant I had to be directly involved in every car I ever drove. I wasn't going to go just leap into somebody's hot rod, make a lap like Leonard Harris did. You know, whatever was the very latest, greatest safety equipment, fire suits, seat belts, helmets, restraint devices. I was usually, for a long period of time, when I lived in Torrance there, I was Bill Simpson's test dummy. You know, Simpson safety products were in Torrance at that time, not far from my house. So I would go over there on a pretty regular basis and visit with him and his general manager, a guy named Fred Crow, a wonderful friend of mine. And they would always say, hey, I'm coming up with this new fire suit material. What's the chances of you wearing one of these? Well, take my measurements and make it up, and I'll come by and pick it up, and I'll let you know, you know. And so I always had access to the very latest, greatest. And even if I hadn't had ready access to it, I would have sought it out, because I understood that the calculated risk only gets better when you look after all of those details. And I was never afraid of being killed in a race car. I acknowledged that it was a distinct possibility. My concern was being maimed or worse yet, burned. And I had real close personal friends like Herm Peterson, you know, who were horribly injured and disfigured. And I almost would have rather lost my life than had that kind of a situation befall upon me. And to be honest with you, it was only a fleeting thought from time to time. Gee, I hope this thing doesn't maim me. But, you know, I have literally sat in the cockpit of a car to be the next one down the fire up road when a guy crashed into the guardrail right next to me and was either killed or lost some limbs or, you know, whatever. Get out of the car, you know, drink a Coke, wait till they clean up the mess, get back in the car and make the qualifying run. It's just, race car drivers are like that. And I don't think I was alone in that regard. You know, when it comes time to perform, that is your sole focus, period. And everything else goes away. I might think about the crash that I just observed on the way home that night, but I never thought about it while I was getting ready to get in the car. I was only thinking about, you know, as time passes, maybe track conditions are going to change. We might have to change the tune up a little bit here or whatever, depending on how long it is. Those are the thought processes that were going through my mind, not the mess that was being carted away in the ambulance, you know. Yeah. And I don't think I'm all that unusual in that regard, to be honest.
Well, and here's another observation that I had, and then we'll talk about the 73 season, but it's that mentality, in my opinion, that caused so much success. Drag racing, like a lot of motorsports, but drag racing is my passion. Drag racing, I cannot believe the amount of successful people that came out in all aspects of drag racing. And I think it's that attitude that caused that to happen. And it's a unique attitude at that time period. I don't think we see attitudes like that today.
I have to unfortunately agree with you. The level of commitment required to start with nothing, zero, and build it to the top echelon of any motorsport is an arduous task, to say the very least. And it requires a great deal of work, concentration, pretty much put aside a new car to drive, or a new house, or a new suit of clothes, or even a new pair of jeans, because race car needs parts. It eats parts and spits them out like crazy. But I have to agree with you about the attitudes of most race car drivers. And I will insert in here something that I'm always reminded of when this kind of a subject comes up about not just drag racing, but motorsports in general. Who is out of their mind enough to think this is a good idea to drive this thing, And I would say to Cool, man, did you see that heap of junk those guys brought in here last week? And God, who would ever drive that? And he said to me something I'll never forget as long as I live. He said, Olson, because he never called me Carl, and I never called him Mike. I was Olson, he was Cool. He said, Olson, name me one vehicle of any kind, airplane, boat, car, rocket ship, that has ever sat idle for lack of finding somebody to drive. Name me one. I couldn't. Somebody is always willing to raise their hand. I always think of my good friend Harry Hibbler, Hand Grenade Harry. He was a ride whore. I mean, I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's what he was. He was a ride whore. If somebody had something and they needed somebody to drive it who was absolutely fearless, and they knew wouldn't say no, they'd call Harry Hibbler, and he was just one of many. And I drove other top fuel cars as well, front motor cars, rear engine cars from time to time. But I was always very well aware of how they were put together, and I was involved in the mechanical aspect of it to the extent that I knew I wasn't climbing in a death machine, or I didn't think that I was anyway. And anytime somebody would show up with something unusual at the racetrack, go, who in the hell would drive a thing like that? I always thought of Mike Cool. Maybe one thing, I'm reminded of things like videos that I saw years ago of some guy that had put a solid propellant rocket in like a Dodge Charger and took it out to the desert and stuffed it into the side of a mountain. Who would do that? E.J. Potter, the Michigan madman, with a small block injected Chevrolet and a motorcycle, and Captain Jack McClure in his rocket powered go-kart. I mean, to this day, Randy, I have never been able to come up with a single vehicle of any kind that's kind of out there that sat idle because nobody was willing to stand up and drive it. And it's a point that Mike made that I will never forget.
That's a great quote. Speaking of rocket powered go-karts, the first drag race I ever went to was at a little drag strip, Wisconsin International Raceway in Kaukauna, Wisconsin. And there was a guy doing an exhibition run there by the name of George Levine, and he had a rocket powered go-kart. And the first race, I think I was 7 years old. This guy takes it headlong into the guardrail. I remember my dad putting his hand over my eyes so I couldn't witness what was going on. But that happened at a race where there was 12 funny cars there doing match races that night. And that was the night that I was hooked forever by the smell, the sound, the crappy wooden bleachers, the crappy lights on the track. It was just the whole feeling. And I understood implicitly as a 7-year-old that this is something I want to hang around. I had no ability or no means to go racing or be even a participant of any kind in my life, but I knew I wanted to be around that scene.
Yeah, thankfully, you and a lot of other people during those years.
We finished up the 72 season with the amazing race at Lions, but racing continued on into 73 for you and Cool. I saw some video. This is a period of time for you guys where you're starting to get some real press and some ink. And I saw videos with you, one where you're describing how you drive the car, and you were in a couple of different movies that were made in the period. And a great period of time for you guys. Talk about 73 and how that season progressed for you.
Yeah. After the last drag race at Lyons, during the off season, we had Tom Hanna finish the body panels and whatever, and we took the car apart and painted everything and polished everything and got it all zippy. Again, Cerny and Nat did the paint and lettering. In fact, that car, what we refer to as our 73 car, was always Mike and my favorite because it just had a clean design, red, white, and blue, with a little bit of psychedelics down the nose panel and whatever, but just a gorgeous car. Cerny and Nat were right at the top of their game at that time. And I could go into what it took to get them to paint a car because they're artists, and they live in a different world, a different reality, you might say. And so, getting them to paint your car and letter it involved a lot of late nights in their shop, making sure they don't escape and keeping them motivated and whatever. And there was a period of time when I was still at Transdap when Mike Cool would take the day shift because he could do his engine work at night. I'd work at Transdap during the day, come home, change clothes, drive out to Norco, which wasn't just right around the corner, to Cerny's shop, relieve Cool. He'd go back to his shop, start building engines, and I'd sit with Cerny and Nat as long as I could keep them there and focused. And eventually it all got done. And the result was just an absolutely gorgeous race car. And to this day, I wish I had it because, it was my favorite race car of all time. We ran the Winter Nationals with that car and did okay. It was a really unusual year in 73 when they ground the track and there was no traction and everybody took their 2-speed transmissions out and went direct drive with a soft clutch and everybody's tune-up was on. It was a pretty miserable event, to be honest with you. Oh. But we got through it, went to Bakersfield, went a few rounds there. And by now we're committed to running pretty much locally and a few NHRA national events, in particular, Winter Nationals, Gator Nationals in Gainesville, Florida, Spring Nationals in Columbus, Ohio, and US Nationals in Indianapolis. And we went to all of those races in 73 and did really well. We were runner-up to Chip Woodall at the Spring Nationals. Oh, and we ran the Summer Nationals in Englishtown as well. Okay. So we ran those national events, but the rest of the time we were strictly local. And at some point, Revell Model Corporation, Revell Toy Company, was really heavy into models of race cars and hot rods. Excuse me. And they were forming the Revell drag racing team. And they had Jungle Jim Lieberman and Jeb Allen and, a bunch of really good high profile cars. And the deal that they would put you on was not necessarily a lot of cash, but they would give you a percentage of the sales of any models of your car, and turned out to be the biggest sponsorship that Mike and I ever had. We signed right up on the program, but part of the program was that their art department exercised their option to design the paint scheme for the car. And I think probably the direction to the art department was make this paint scheme so unique that it will stand out wherever it is. And so the art department kicked out this thing, and it was a bright yellow paint scheme with some red, white, and blue stripes. And to be honest with you, it was just butt ugly. It really was. Cool called it the big banana from Santa Ana. And it caught on. Everywhere we went, oh yeah, there's the big banana from Santa Ana. Money talks. And certainly the trade-off between aesthetics and cash was not a hard decision to make. And it was a really good deal. And they also helped to raise the awareness of our car, because when you've got a model out there and they're hyping it and advertising it, it's kind of a big deal. Yeah, it's good ink, and it's good for everything that you do, particularly with your product sponsors, which were the majority of sponsors at that time.
Was it
Oil,
Revell that came
tires.
up with the fast guys?
You know who came up with the fast guys?
No,
Nat Quick. And
really?
let me tell you how it happened. We'll digress just a little bit, but it's a great story.
Sure.
When they were painting our 1972 car, our first rear engine car, with that really psychedelic paint job, all kinds of different colors and wavy things, and a really distinct paint scheme, to say the least. I think their imaginations just went a little wild on them on that deal. But when it came time for Nat to letter it, in gold leaf letters down the nose piece, starting just below the cowl on the windshield and all the way down pretty much to the front axle, in gold leaf, in real fancy lettering, scroll type lettering, he wrote DA, fast guys. And it was so exotic with the typeface and everything that you really couldn't read it unless first you recognized that there were actually letters there in the midst of this big psychedelic swirl of paint, and then try to figure out exactly what those letters spelled out. And it was fun to watch people when we get to the racetrack and unload the car in the pits, and people would be walking around and looking at it, taking pictures of. Every once in a while, somebody would start looking at the nose piece, and you'd see them. And then finally, the light would come on. Oh, yeah, the fast guys. So it was George Cerny and Nat Quick that came up with that name. And they actually even put that on the 73 car when it was still in all aluminum. And you will see it in the pictures of the last drag race. Well, from that point on, you know, with the 72 car, there weren't that many people that figured out what it said. But then it became common knowledge. And from that point on, we were pretty much the fast guys. We didn't coin it. You know, those artist kind of guys, maybe in a little bit of a drug-induced haze, you know, just thought that would be a neat deal, and it turned out to be a really neat deal, and one that I'm really glad that happened, because you know, it's something that I reflect back on with great pride, to be honest with you. And so, being the fast guys already, when Revell picked us up, that's how they promoted it.
Okay.
Cool and Olson to fast guys, and so that's pretty much what we became from that time on.
Any idea where you can get that model these days?
I have one in my garage.
Oh,
One.
there you
And
go.
I have one completed right over here on one of the shelves in my office.
Okay.
That was built by a professional model builder for Revell to do photographs and things for their promotional materials and their box cover and whatever.
I actually went looking for one. I had
one other that somebody had given to me a few years ago, in the original box with the cellophane wrapping on it and everything. And I was going to hold on to it, maybe give it to my grandkids or something. But when a guy named Rick Lorenzen created something called the Lions Drag Racing Museum, or the Lions Drag Strip Museum, part of the Lions Automobilia Foundation down just a few miles from where Lions Drag Strip used to be. Part of his unbelievable collection of cars and memorabilia are some dioramas, and one of them is a model shop that has all kinds of car models from that era. And the one thing they didn't have is a model of the Cool and Olson car in the box, because they don't hardly exist anymore. And if they do, they seem to generate a fairly substantial price tag. And so I just thought it would be important to provide Rick Lorenzen with that car for his model collection, because it was in fact the car that won the last drag race at Lions, which is heavily featured in the museum, of course. Right. So now I'm down to one complete one and a nice little plastic box up there, and one still in the package that I hopefully will be able to give to my grandkids someday.
Well, I went searching for the Fast Guys Revell model, and I could never track it down. I tracked down actually one of the Jungle Gym models. I paid $270 for it, open package, and you can see the couple here behind me. That was what I did when I was a kid. I put all these models together. So, you know, I don't think I ever had your model though when I was a kid, but I went and tried to track all these models down. Let me tell you something, Carl. They cost a fortune to buy
Yeah.
them now,
Oh yeah.
but it's
Especially
cool.
if they're still in the original box.
Oh yeah, it's cool stuff.
And I know people that have them,
Really?
and are never going to depart with them.
Oh,
Ever. They're
absolutely
going to pass
not.
them down for generations or something. I don't
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. So 73 season is you guys didn't actually run the entire NHRA circuit, did you?
No,
Okay.
no. We ran Gator Nationals, Winter Nationals, Gator Nationals, Spring Nationals, Summer Nationals, U.S. Nationals.
Okay.
Oh, and of course the World Finals.
Okay.
So we ran 5 of the 8.
And so, and you're in for the entire season. You guys were in the actual yellow banana from Santa Ana, right?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
With the
Absolutely.
Hillborn, with the shotgun Hillborn injector on it. We're going to put a picture of that car up because
yeah, and actually, the 73 car never had the shotgun. That was the 74 car.
Okay.
73 car had a standard Hillborn 4-port upright injector. And some people confuse the two cars because they were painted identically.
Yeah.
But, the 74 car was a whole different animal, and we'll talk about that later. The highlight of the season for us, undoubtedly, was the U.S. Nationals. Yeah. We towed that car back there. We qualified really well. And we marched through eliminations and made it all the way to the final against Gary Beck, who had won the race a year earlier, had been running quicker than we had throughout the entire event. But I felt that there was a likelihood, or at least a distinct possibility, that in the final he might try to overpower the racetrack. And I told him, cool, just set this thing up the way we've been running it. Because I don't think we can run any quicker, to be honest with you. We're running teens and low 20s, 620s, 16s. And anyway, we went up there and staged and left, and he kind of I saw him pull out a little bit on me, and then he just immediately disappeared, and I knew he had smoked the tires. It's not my first rodeo. I've seen that before. Guy disappears that quick. He is either shut off or he's lost traction, you know. And for the next couple of seconds, I'm counting contingency money and wondering who the trophy girl is going to be this year. And, you know, I would say probably the 1,200 foot mark and the 1,320 foot drag strip, I saw his front wheel. And by the time we got to the ET light, he had gone by me and won the race. And I was gutted, absolutely gutted. I still chide myself to this day for assuming that I was about to win the biggest drag race on the planet. Because all that did is create an even greater level of disappointment when it didn't happen. You know, that's as close as we ever came to winning Indy, and we only ran there one more year, and that's another story altogether. But we had a really good year. We ran well everywhere that we ran. We didn't win any national events, and we didn't run any IHRA events at all for a number of reasons. Some of them being safety related, some of them being economic. I mean, we were their world champion in 1972, and they didn't really want to offer us a lot for the 73 season. After I crashed that car at Dallas and was down at the end of the racetrack, the smoldering heap, I waited for the ambulance and the emergency crew to get there and put out the fire. And if I had needed rescuing, get me out of what was left of the car. I had already done that myself and waited, and nothing ever showed up.
Wow.
Turns out they'd had some problems and transported both of their ambulances before the final round and decided, what could possibly go wrong? We only have a couple more races to go. That put a real bad feeling in me. And I decided that I just wasn't willing to, between the economic issue and the safety issue, we just decided we don't need that. We're not going to go on tour anymore. We don't have to make a living with this car anymore. We're just running it for fun now. And so we concentrated on NHRA, where we knew safety standards were at the very top rung of the ladder, and where you knew everybody's getting paid the same round money you were, and nobody was in on a guarantee, and nobody got their choice of lanes if they didn't deserve it. And It was just a straight up deal. And it was never that way with IHRA or AHRA. There was always some hocus pocus involved in the mix. And we just didn't need that anymore.
At the U.S. Nationals that year in '73, was that still a 32 car field yet at that point?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that Gainesville Spring Nationals, World Finals, those were all 32 car shows. Yeah,
that's it. I was never at a 32 car show like that. So for me, that's even hard to imagine. Everything was 16 car fields, but that had to be an amazing weekend. I know Mike Couch has told me many times that the U.S. Nationals working it, he said it was just a marathon for all the people that worked those races.
Oh, absolutely. Racers and workers. The race is 6 days long, and a lot happening all the time. Thousands of spectators, hundreds of cars, just a big deal. I mean, it was in fact the biggest race on the planet. And people sometimes ask me, do you have any regrets in your racing career? You quit earlier than anybody might have expected, at least the driving part of it. Do you have any regrets at all? And my only regret is that I never won that race. Came close, and that coming that tantalizingly close to winning and not is just creates a level of frustration that's hard to describe, and then to go back the next year in '74 and be a first round loser, it's just like, okay, this isn't going to happen. It's just not.
So you get through the '73 season. Now we're on to '74. You're still in the seat at this point.
Yes.
And you guys went back to the U.S. Nationals in '74, and there's a neat little story about transport. If I remember right, Carl, is this transporting parts on an airplane? And
you're a year off.
I'm a year off. That was '73 to the U.S. Nationals.
The year we were runner up.
Okay. What
happened was, and I'll get through this as quickly as I can. I don't want to drag it out. What happened was I came out down with a really bad eye infection. It started as pink eye, and then it turned into something worse. And the optometrist that I was going to, or the ophthalmologist, said, you cannot get on an airplane and fly because of the altitude pressure differences and whatever. And you have a serious infection in your eye, and just going outdoors, you need to go home and get in a closet is what you need to do. You need to close all the blinds, and you just need to let that heal. And he gave me some drops to put in and whatever. And well, the next race that we were committed to was the PRO race at Tulsa, Oklahoma, which originally had been on top of the U.S. Nationals at Indy. And when that didn't work out well for either NHRA or the PRO, they moved it to a week in advance of the Nationals, so that everybody coming from all over the country could run Tulsa and then go directly on to Indy. Well, the Tulsa race just happened to be right when I had this eye infection, and we were committed to our sponsors to run that event. So we looked around for somebody to put in the car, and we decided on Jeb Allen's brother, Les Allen, who also had driven the family top fuel cars and junior fuel cars and whatever, and he'd driven some other cars, and we figured he was probably about the best guy we could put in for that one event. He ran the car there, and during one of the rounds of eliminations, he let the car drift off the left side of the track and got into the dirt and started hitting chuck holes and bushes and things, and ripped the left front wheel off the car, and bent the axle in half, and all the radius rods and all the steering members were junk. Didn't hurt the chassis, but it hurt everything else in the front end. And Cool called me, and I was at home in a dark room, answering the phone. And he said, I got some good news and some bad news. Well, what's that? Well, the car's still in one piece, kinda. What do you mean, kinda? And what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is that Leslie ran off the track and bent a bunch of the stuff up. And so what you need to do is you need to call Woody Gilmore tomorrow morning, Monday morning, as soon as the shop opens up. And you need to tell him we need a new front axle, radius rods, steering cross members, This was rack and pinion steering, so there were no drag link or anything, but, and we need a left front wheel and a P&F spindle. And I'm like, oh, Mike, the race is next weekend. What are you talking about? I'll do it. I'll call Woody, but I got a pretty good idea what he's going to say. And so I did. I called Woody, and he said, look, I'm sorry, man. I'm up to here. I've got delivery schedules that are past due. I've got people all over me. I'm just not in a position to stop what I'm doing and rejig for building a front axle and all of that kind of stuff. He said, I'm sorry, Carl. I just can't help you with that. I just can't do it in 2 days. It's just not possible. And I said, I understand completely. That's kind of what I expected, but I figured we'd run it up the flagpole and see what happens. So I hung up, and he called me back and he said, I just thought of something. He said, I just delivered a complete chassis, virtually identical to yours, to a guy named George the Bushmaster Schreiber. And he lives in Long Beach, which is not far from you. And I don't think he's even put the car together yet. So my suggestion is give the Bushmaster a call and see if maybe you can borrow those parts for a while. So thank you very much. I knew George had his phone number, called him up, and he said, I told him what the deal was and what parts we needed. He said, how soon can you be here? And I said, 20 minutes, half hour. He said, okay. And I showed up a half hour later, and he had all the parts piled in his driveway, and we loaded them in my truck, and I drove home. Well, what am I going to do with this stuff now? It's too late to ship it. There's no way I can box it up or do anything. So I told Cool what the deal was, and he said, just bring it all on the airplane with you. I said, what are you talking about? He says, you can't check it because it's too big or whatever. And he said, just tape everything together and carry it on the airplane. I said, Mike, are you on psychedelics or something right now? I mean, you can't be serious. And he said, no, we have to have those parts if we're going to run this race. And this is the best chance we'll ever have of winning the U.S. Nationals. I said, okay, I'll give it a try. So I ended up taking a red-eye flight to Indy because I was still working at Waterman Racing Engines and all of that kind of stuff at that time. And so I showed up at Los Angeles International Airport at about 11 p.m. one night, like a Wednesday night. And I had all this stuff with me, and everybody looked at me really weird. But these were different times. There was no TSA security, you bought a ticket, you parked your car, you walked across, and you got on the airplane, So I got my boarding pass. I didn't bring the stuff with me when I went up to the desk to get the boarding pass, but they started boarding passengers, and I kind of waited down towards the tail end, and I finally picked this mess of tubing up and walked down the gangway onto the airplane. There was a flight attendant, a female flight attendant there. And when she saw me coming, she looked at me and she just started. And I went, this is not going to go well. I can see right away, this is not going to go well, but oh well. So I got to the door and she said, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is, but I can't allow you to bring it on this airplane. I said, let me explain what this is. These are parts of a race car that are intended to go on our race car that we're going to run this weekend at the biggest drag race in the world in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I said, I know from watching the boarding of this plane that it's not even half full. And I know that I have a window seat with nobody next to me. And if I don't get these parts on this airplane, we're not going to be able to run this race, which is the most important race of the year for us. As it turns out, her husband was a hot rodder and a race fan. She goes, you're going to the Indy of the Nationals, huh? And I said, yeah. She goes, you will never tell anybody that I let you do this, right? And I said, Scout's honor. I don't even know your name. It's right. I know it's there on your tag, but I don't know it. And those words will never pass my lips. And I don't know. I'd hug and kiss you, but I'm kind of busy with all this crap. And so I'm going to get on the airplane and we're going to go to Indianapolis. And she smiled and laughed at me. And I walked on the plane and I ended up putting all that stuff next to the bulkhead under my seat and the one ahead of me fit in there just fine, no problem at all. I hate to think what would have happened if the plane would have crashed and it would have been flying around the cockpit. But bottom line, we flew all night, got to Indy, and next morning Mike Cool picked me up at the airport, and I said, "Here you go, big boy. Let's get to work." And we did. Went to the track, bolted all the new parts on, and went racing.
So we're into 1974 now, and Gilmore builds another new car for you, and you guys actually take that car out right away at the March meet, as I understand, and set low ET and low or high speed.
It was our best weekend ever. There's a terminology that a lot of drag racers use, and it's called running the table. Number one qualifier, top speed, low ET, top eliminator. That was our weekend. Drag racing has always been one of those things where a lot of times you go to the track, you expect to whip everybody's butt, and you don't. And there's other times you go and you think, well, we might be competitive, but this problem, and everything falls into place. The 1974 Bakersfield March meet was one of those events where everything fell into place. We got a brand new state-of-the-art Woody Gilmore car. We got a Donovan 417 with a 3/8 stroker in it, and the new shotgun Hilborn injector, and a big rear wing, which we didn't have on the 73 car, some better tires. The combination just was perfect. And we unloaded and ran a low ET of qualifying. And we knew that we were going to be competitive. I hesitate to say we were looking forward to winning the event, because I never went to the track truly expecting to win, just expecting to do well, And what happened that year was that eliminations got rained out. And the event, the final elimination, Sunday eliminations, were postponed for a week. So we had a whole week to salivate over the fact that we were low qualifier, and qualifying was over. There wasn't going to be any more qualifying. So we already knew who we were going. And again, this is a 32 car show. And I mean, every badass in the country is there. But we were reasonably confident that we were going to have a good outing the following weekend. And we not only set low ET of every round, although I think I did get one whole shot victory against Frank Bradley. And those were always enjoyable for a driver, especially against guys like Frank Bradley. But we, during eliminations, we ran the first 5-second run ever at Famoso. So we worked our way through eliminations, ran Tony Nancy in the final. He spun a leak on his burnout, and we made a single for the victory. And so on our way home, we were able to ruminate on the fact that we ran the table: low qualifier, low ET, top speed, top fuel eliminator, and the first car in the fives at Bakersfield, and consequently membership in the Krager 5-Second Club. To say it was a good outing would be a gross understatement. I mean, I don't know that our feet settled back to the ground for a couple of weeks after that event. And yeah, it was a really good one.
Well, and you guys mainly stayed local then the rest of that. Did you ran a few NHRA events in 74?
Yeah, we ran Gainesville, we ran Indy, and we ran the finals.
Okay.
I think I believe those were the only 3 national events we ran that year.
And thinking about 1974 reminds me of another one of my favorite people on the planet, which is Marvin Graham. There's a whole story about heading to the 74 Nationals too that involves Marvin Graham. It's a great story. Would you mind telling us that?
Not at all.
That's a great story.
Marvin was pretty much unknown at the time. He raced locally in Oklahoma, Texas, that mid-south region of the country, and never got that far from home. He had a television repair shop in Oklahoma City. And so, he had a wife and kids and mortgage, like all of us did. And because we ran so well with our Donovan, Mike Cool was called upon a great deal for advice. And you might think it's crazy for a guy who probably is as knowledgeable about those engines as anybody on the planet, sharing that information with the people you're going to race against. But that's the way Mike Cool was. In all the years we raced together, I marveled at how forthright and honest he was about our combination. I think his attitude may have been, I'm going to teach them everything they know, but not necessarily everything that I know. That kind of a deal. He would answer their direct questions, but he wasn't going to send them a top to bottom list of every setup in the tune-up or whatever. He always, kept something in his side pocket. But beside that, I mean, he was perfectly willing to help anybody that asked for it. One thing I have to say about it is that while he was asked for and dispensed a great deal of advice and information, if somebody ignored that advice and did something else because somebody else told them to, or if they thought it was a better idea, that's the last information they ever got from Mike Cool. But if they listened to him and did what he said, he'd bend over backwards to help them any way he could. And Marvin Graham was one of those guys. He ran a Donovan, he ran the BRC combination. He had a car that was very similar to ours. It wasn't a Woody car, but it was very similar in its construction. And because of the advice thing and the conversations that they had, Mike Cool and Marvin Graham had developed a communicating relationship. And Mike pretty much convinced Marvin Graham to do his complete combination. 3/8 Velasco stroker crank, BRC rods and pistons, 300 down, 200 down, whatever it was at the time. 671 Larkin blower, Hillborn injector or whatever, yada, yada, yada. And this camshaft for sure, and this magneto, and these spark plugs. And so Marvin ordered all of those parts, and there wasn't a time for them to be gathered up and shipped off or shipped independently from all the different manufacturers. So he asked Mike Cool if he'd go around and collect all of this stuff and bring it with us, put it in our trailer, and stop in Oklahoma City on the way to Indy for the Nationals. Mike was only too happy to do that. I didn't know Marvin all that well at that time. We'd had some minor conversations, but we certainly weren't close friends or anything like that. I just hadn't had that much, we hadn't had that much exposure to each other. He certainly knew who we were, and I knew who he was. But we stopped in Oklahoma City at his house, where he had a little 2-car garage where he kept his whole racing operation, pretty typical of those days. And we unloaded the parts in his garage, and he was deathly ill with a bad case of probably the flu, because he was sweating profusely, horrible sore throat, runny nose, eyes are watering. He looked like hell. In fact, he wouldn't even come out from the house to the garage to help us unload the parts. That's how sick he was. And when we did go to talk to him, he said, "Guys, I really appreciate you doing this, but there's no way in the world that I'm going to be able to be in Indianapolis this weekend. It's just not going to happen. I'm way too sick." And I'll never forget Mike Cool saying, "Well, you weaks suck." You're what? Just because you got a case of the sniffles, you're not going to go to the biggest drag race of the year with all these new awesome parts? You are a weak suck. You don't even deserve to call yourself a drag racer. Finger on the left. And I mean, I look at Marvin and his eyeballs are just, what did this guy just say to me? I mean, he feels like crap anyway, but oh well. So anyway, I said, "Mike, you're pretty hard on that guy, weren't you?" He says, "You mark my words, he will be at Indy." I said, "We just left him. I mean, he should be in a hospital, in the emergency room, He said, "That was called motivation." So, okay, well, we'll see about that. I'm totally unconvinced, right? Well, he wasn't there for the first day, which I think was a Thursday, but on Friday, Marvin Graham tows in with his race car, with his new Donovan 417 with all the whistles and bells. And to make a long story short, wins the race.
Yep, wins the race.
And the reaction to the drag racing world when it was announced that Marvin Graham from Oklahoma City won the biggest drag race in the world, the reaction was, Marvin who? And to this day, it's Marvin who.
And I'm curious, how did Mike take that happening? The fact that he helped out Marvin and Marvin ended up winning the race. How did Mike take that?
He was thrilled for him.
Was he? Okay, good.
Yeah, thrilled to the core. I think I had mentioned previously, we raced Grant Stoms from New Jersey in the first round. Yeah. And I had such horrible tire shake on the run that I aborted the run. And it's a good thing I did because we broke some frame rails in the chassis.
Wow.
And he went on and blew up an engine and the lights or whatever, but he won the first round. And that was the last run I ever made at the NHRA US Nationals. So we were then stuck in the pits, drinking beer, commiserating with people the rest of the day on Monday, Labor Day. And the final round got rained out at that event. So they actually ran the final round on Tuesday morning in front of about 100 spectators. And we went out just because we now had this relationship with Marvin, and we're really thrilled to see him in the final round. And we weren't exactly confident that he was going to win the race, but you know, you're in the final round. We know in drag racing, anything can happen, and he won. And that pretty much cemented our relationship for all time. And to this day, Marvin Graham is one of my very closest personal friends in the world. I can't say that we go more than a couple of weeks without having a lengthy conversation about the good old days and reminisce on things like the '74 U.S. Nationals.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you guys supported his effort after you guys went out in the first round. To me, something that I never understood about drag racers before I began, hanging out in this world was that it's just a fraternity. You guys were all wanted to kick each other's ass on the track, but at the end of the day, it was let's have a beer together. I never understood that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's particularly in that era. Yeah. That's the way it was.
And to bring it forward, to come to an event like the Nitro Revival, which I know you weren't there because you were off deep sea fishing, which we'll talk about that in just a second. I don't know anything about deep sea fishing, but I want to hear about that. But the Nitro Revival, I did not see an unhappy face in that entire place. And I just marveled as I walked by and listened to these guys telling these stories. And I took a picture of Harry Hibbler sitting in the K&G Speed Associates dragster, and I actually put a quote underneath it: "The fountain of youth has been found. It comes in a front engine dragster." He's got this smile on his face that is just incredible.
Yeah.
And the fraternity that you guys have is what makes an event like that so special. It was just amazing to be there.
Yeah, it was that way then, and it has continued to be that way with those people ever since, and will be until we're all gone.